About this a little bit last week, but just as a reminder, those of you who are in the back, you have an extra burden. You're choosing to sit back there. What that means is you also need to choose to prove to me that you are really paying attention. Otherwise, I'm just going to move you. And so I'm going to be looking for things. I'm pretty good at this by now, and I can't guarantee that I know exactly what's going on. But if I see your attention directed under the table, if you're looking like this, and your hands are down here, I'm going to assume you're on your phone, and I'm just going to ask you to move. And if you go like this and say, not on my phone, it's too late. I want to see your eyeballs. I want to see your hands actively writing stuff down, thinking about what we're talking about. You got to prove to me that you are really locked in order to be able to sit in those back tables. I generally like to start with some sort of big picture stuff, but it's Monday. We got a little bit of a late start anyway because I was otherwise engaged, which means we're just going to launch. So if you don't have something to write with and write on, get it out right now. So Angel, do you have notes? April, Lucius, you have stuff to write with and write on? I want to see notebooks, I want to see pencils. You have a job as a student, and if nothing else, your job is to convince me at a distance that you're actually trying. And everybody can do that. We're all capable of doing that. Let's see, so I'm going to go through some stuff. As always, if I write it or if I draw it, I want you to write it and or draw it. There's going to be a bunch of stuff here that you do not need to write down. But if I'm not actively writing something or underlining something, I still want to see your eyeballs. I want you to be listening and thinking about what I'm saying. The point of not having you write it is that you've written some of this stuff already. And today what we're going to talk about is adaptations. Mr. Fiskin has talked about adaptations a bunch, and we brought it up last week. On Thursday, I talked about adaptations with the adaptive radiation assignment, where we were looking at how organisms can evolve really quickly, and we see these like rapid branching and changing when they, for example, get into a new environment or there's some sort of a change. And what happens is we get this rapid diversification and rapid development of something that I call an adaptation. And we're going to look at those in a little bit more detail. And the goal is for you to be able to think about what an adaptation is, for you to sort of be able to imagine how adaptations are influenced by natural selection. And then we'll talk about the finches. We talked about those last week as well, so we'll just touch base on that real quickly. And then the work that you're going to start today and complete tomorrow involves identifying an adaptation and then like really kind of working through everything, all the evolutionary parts of that adaptation. So, Lucius, do you have paper? Okay, can you borrow a piece of paper from somebody? All right, so as a reminder, natural selection is a process. And you don't have to write any of this down because you talked about it already, but what I want you to think about is a lot of times people talk about natural selection as being survival of the fittest. That's not quite right. That phrase is often used. It's not that it's wrong, it's just not super clear. Natural selection is less about survival and more about reproduction. Those two things are linked together with organisms. Organisms that survive for longer, on average, will reproduce more. So yes, fitness enhances survival, but what fitness really does is it enhances reproduction. If you have alleles that allow for you to make more babies, then every generation, your alleles are going to be represented by a larger and larger percentage of the population. And that leads to a change in allele frequency. Beneficial alleles become more common. Alleles that are harmful become less common. And that is the definition of evolution. For natural selection to take place, we need a few things. You got to start with genetic variation. We haven't talked about how you get there yet, but we will. Genetic variation just means different alleles for the same gene. So different alleles for hair color, different alleles for eye color, different alleles for finger length, different alleles for earlobe attachment. All of those different alleles represent genetic variation. And then there also needs to be something that we call selection pressure. Selection pressure is some external factor. It might be purely environmental, like temperature, wind, rain, exposure to sunlight. It might be another organism, a predator or a prey species. It might involve interactions between organisms and other organisms of the same species. And these two things together are what cause alleles to become more or less common. That is the definition of evolution. Evolution is just changes in allele frequency. When those changes happen because some alleles are beneficial and some alleles are harmful to individuals, then we see evolution through natural selection. When we talked about adaptations last week, I mentioned that these are generally caused by natural selection. So what we're looking at with adaptations are just general genetic traits, like alleles, basically, traits that are controlled by alleles, but there's specific ones that we can really identify. So there's a couple pieces to adaptations. One is that they are heritable, which means they can be passed on to offspring. Behaviors or physical traits that improve biological fitness, and that's one of the things that we talked about. So we could imagine the coloration on a predator, for example, might be considered to be an adaptation. Organisms that blend into the environment more are less likely to be seen by prey species. That means hunters are more likely to be successful. That means they're more likely to survive. That means they're more likely to have babies. So this coloration, if that's a genetic trait, which it is, if it's a genetic trait, then any coloration that helps predators hide is more likely to be more common in future generations. That's evolution. When we think about adaptations, in this class, we're going to think specifically about adaptations that are caused by natural selection. That's not always true. There's other types of evolution. Natural selection is one way evolution can occur. There's also artificial selection. There's something called genetic drift. There's something called sexual selection. All of these things are different ways that evolution can occur. Adaptations tend to be directed by natural selection. And so camouflage fur, as you can see here, is a really good example. The long necks of giraffes are a really good example. And organisms that produce toxins, poisons, that if other organisms eat them, can injure or kill the predator organism. And so when we think about adaptations, kind of the general rule of thumb is it has to be something obvious. Sometimes it's something obvious and we're not quite sure what it's for, but we know we can figure it out. Like if you saw a giraffe outside of its natural habitat, if you just saw a giraffe in the zoo, you might be like, okay, that long neck's gotta be for something. And we know that's an adaptation. Now, if you see a giraffe in its natural habitat and you realize, oh yeah, they're eating leaves on really tall trees, that's what the adaptation is for. That makes it even more obvious. With some of the traits that we've talked about, particularly with humans, they're not really things that fall into the category of adaptations. Earlobe attachment is not something that has an obvious use. There's differences, right? Like there's differences and they're genetic, but also there's nothing about earlobe attachedness that would make us say, oh, that's helpful because, you know, if your earlobes are attached, you're more aerodynamic. Or if your earlobes aren't attached, then you know, you're less likely to get injured in a fight because your earlobes will wobble and absorb the energy from a blow. Like, we know that that's not what earlobe attachment is about. It doesn't really serve an obvious purpose. We wouldn't think of it as an adaptation. Our thumbs, on the other hand, we know what that's all about. The fact that our thumbs move in a different axis than the rest of our fingers allow us to pick things up. And that is really powerful. That has given us like a huge evolutionary boost. We talked about the Galapagos finches, so just as a reminder, they are on islands, the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. We know for a variety of reasons, we have a whole bunch of evidence to show that they all evolved from the same common ancestor, the same original species. But they are very different now, and all of the differences that we notice most readily are associated with their food sources. So for example, some of the Galapagos finches have real big, sharp, thick beaks that allow them to get at fruits and seeds, things that have a hard covering or like leathery covering to them. Some of them have longer, thinner beaks for insects. And we have all these like ways of evaluating the finches, like the crushing and probing and grasping and like nectar. We've got computer programs that evaluate differences in beak shapes so that we can figure out how they're genetically related. Yeah. And so when we think about these adaptations, one of the real key things is that they're easily recognizable for serving some sort of a purpose. They have a function, and that's kind of the real key. And the reason that we focus on adaptations is because, first of all, they're interesting, and you'll see that in just a second. But second of all, because we know what they're for, we can really dive in and think about how they might have evolved. And a lot of times what we see is there have been these big flips. So there might be a structure or a characteristic from an organism that serves one purpose. And then all of a sudden, it starts serving another purpose. And natural selection kind of takes it in a completely different direction. And it's really cool when we figure that out. One of the most common arguments that people make against evolution has to do with complex structures like the eye. The eye has been used for like over a century as an example of why evolution can't be a good explanation for how organisms have changed over time. So think about this for a second. Let's say you have an organism that is sort of like a little animal, but basically it's like doesn't have eyes. Okay, so it has no eyes at all, and so there's just nothing. Like just imagine like a humanoid type creature with just like nothing. How do you get from that to an eye through natural selection? Because like what sort of like spontaneous genetic variation is just gonna all of a sudden make an eye with all the layers and all the like rods and cones and all the connections to the brain? That's not possible. It isn't possible. And that is not what happened. You didn't go from nothing to eyes. But how do you go from nothing to part of an eye? Like, does it make any sense that there might have been some organisms that developed lengthy nerve connections that went to nowhere? They didn't hook to anything, just saying. And does that make sense? I mean, that could happen. Would there be any advantage to it? Probably not. So it wouldn't have started with nerve connections. What about some sort of an orb, just like a circular patch? Could that have done it? Well, not if it didn't have nerve connections. So you can't get an entire functioning eye from nothing, but you also aren't gonna develop part of an eye because it doesn't do anything. So when we think about adaptations, generally adaptations are the story of something simple that did one thing that then started being used for something different and became more complex, and then started being used for something different and then became more complex until eventually we ended up with a full complex structure. What were you going to say?
Is that like maybe like the evolution of the eye could have been a birth defect at first, and then that birth
Yeah.
defect was carried.
It does start with a mutation, absolutely. So it always starts with a mutation. The thing is, for it to continue, for it to become more common, it has to be at least non-harmful, if not useful.
Could be useless.
It could be useless, and potentially, if it's a dominant allele, it could potentially grow to be more prevalent in the population. Yeah, but that still doesn't explain how you would get a complex structure like the eye. So one of the things that we're going to do, and I'm going to have you do, is think about how you could get a complex structure starting from, nothing or a less complex structure. When we think about evolutionary origins, typically what we want to know is not what did it look like before it looks the way that it does now, but instead, what was it for? So I'm going to give you some examples in just a moment, but one of the things that we might want to think about is, do we see evidence in the fossil record for transitional structures or behaviors? So with eyes, for example, do we see organisms that have primitive sensory organs? And that's where things get really interesting, because that is exactly what we see. You don't go from nothing to an eye. What you go from is nothing to a little spot that has some sensory attachments that is nothing like an eye. It's a sensory organ. It can receive information and transmit information to a brain, but it is not an eye. A lot of times we call those eye spots or just sensory patches. And then we want to think about how some sort of primitive structure might have been beneficial. So if you have a mutation that results in a spot on an organism's outer covering that allows it to be slightly more responsive to light, how can that help? They can't see. They're not looking out and seeing colors and shapes. They're not perceiving things in 3 dimensions. But how might it be an advantage for an organism to have a tiny little spot on its skin that can respond simply to light? Can anybody think of an idea? Actually, yeah.
It's kind of like the anglerfish with the light, since it's so dark, it can be used as like a way to find the food or stuff.
So all it's doing is detecting the presence or absence of light. You're right that if you can't see, the ability to generate your own light would be helpful, but we're not there yet. You guys?
Maybe the creature is uses light as food, like a food source.
Okay, so if, for example, you are a photosynthetic protist, the ability to detect and potentially respond to sunlight might make it easier for you to photosynthesize. Absolutely, yeah. If you are photosynthetic, the ability to respond to sunlight is really important. We know that there are organisms that do this. Have any of you ever seen plants that can move with the sunlight? They're phototropic. They move and they face different directions depending on sunlight. There are plants that will close up their leaves at night and open them up in the day. They can sense sunlight and they change their positioning depending on whether or not they're in sunlight or not. They can't see, right? Like a plant can't see me. It's just a little primitive light sensor. And that's effectively how that might have benefited the organism. And then you can think about how natural selection might jump in. If you have an organism that can potentially detect a little bit of sunlight, then maybe we can change its behavior so that it is more likely to survive and reproduce. B, will you come sit over here? And then one of the things that we want to try to figure out is, where did these things show up to the best of our ability? And sometimes we just don't know, but a lot of times we can tell. A lot of times we can look back through the fossil record and make some interpretations to figure out where a particular adaptation or a precursor to an adaptation showed up. So we're going to talk about taste buds for a second, and you don't need to write any of this stuff down, but this is just an example of something that's kind of cool to think about, because taste buds are a pretty complex structure. They respond to chemicals, and they send signals to your brain that tell you about like what food tastes like. So let's think about this for a second. So basically, what we know is that there are organisms like bacteria and protists that have little chemical sensors in their cell membrane that can detect sugar. They chemically react with sugar, and when those chemoreceptors are activated, something happens on the inside of the organism. Typically, it's related to a structure that allows the organism to move around, a flagellum, a little whip-like tail thing. So if you are a bacterium and you're just floating around, and all of a sudden the piece of sugar comes into contact with this little chemoreceptor, then inside the cell, there's a bunch of chemical reactions that cause a flagellum to start spinning. And off you go, closer to where the source of sugar might be. And then the next step in the evolutionary development of taste buds has to do with a connection between receptor cells and brains. So this is like jumping, right? Like, how do the brains get there? We're not talking about that. But if you have brains and you have these chemical sensors, it makes sense to think that if there's some connection, some sort of nerve cell that connects the brain to a chemical sensor, that then the brain can coordinate activity in the body. And if then these receptor cells mutate, and a lot of times they're going to mutate in a way that's maybe harmful, right? Like maybe they don't work anymore, or maybe they like trigger the organism moving towards something that's not good for it, something toxic. But if it happens to be a mutation that changes the sensitivity of the cell in a way that's beneficial, maybe it detects something besides just sugar and protein, sugar and more complex carbohydrates, then these organisms could potentially find food more quickly. And then if you have organisms that have some of those chemoreceptors in the mouth, then instead of just responding to like external environmental stimuli, now you have this like, well, if you put food in your mouth, these chemical sensors can potentially give you information about whether that food is good or potentially dangerous. And that is effectively what happened. And we know where taste buds first arose. They arose right about the same time as jaws arose. So there is a group of organisms called jawed fishes. We're included in that group, and they're called the gnathostomes. And the gnathostomes, including us, at around the same time that we evolved jaws, we started evolving taste buds as well. So this work, thinking about an adaptation and thinking about the evolutionary origin of the adaptation, is what I want you to start today. And we'll wrap it up tomorrow. And tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about a second part here that has to do with mutations. So two things. One is there's an assignment posted to Canvas. You can look at it, but you probably don't need to yet. And overall, what that assignment lays out is that you're going to find an adaptation, talk about its benefits for the organism or organisms that have it, talk about some ways that other organisms might accomplish the same task with a different adaptation, and then think about hypothetical, at least, evolutionary origins, right? This is the big picture, everything that you're going to do today and tomorrow. What I want you to target for today are these two things. First, I want you to work with one other person, no groups of three, not a single group of three, with no exceptions whatsoever. I want you to find an adaptation that you think is really cool. And I am taking beaver teeth off the list, because that's the one I'm gonna talk about tomorrow when I give you an example. No beaver teeth. Also, no adaptations that you already know a lot about, or even maybe just a little bit about. So if you, like, I've talked about thumbs as an adaptation a bunch. That's off the table. Giraffe necks, off the table. We're not gonna talk about the things that you already know about, but I want you to find something really cool that you don't know about, okay? And then, once you've found that, we just start kind of thinking about, like, finding information about how specifically it benefits the organism. Some of you may get to this point as well today, where you're starting to look at, okay, well, how do other organisms do this, right? Like, not all organisms have jointed limbs, but a lot of organisms can move around. So what do you do if you don't have jointed limbs and you're still a mobile organism? So think about, like, worms. Worms can move around, they don't have joints. So how, like jointed limbs is a great adaptation for the organisms that have it, but it doesn't mean nobody else can move. All right, so this is your job. These two things everybody's going to be able to get to today. This, not everybody will get to, but some of you at least will start. What I am going to be looking for and expecting is I want to see you working with one other person at the most, and I want to see you really locked into this work. We're sort of done with the, I'm going to just show up to class and play games on my computer. I don't want to see any phones today, none at all. If your Chromebook is out of batteries, go figure out a way to get a charger. You might have to go to the office to do it, but no more phones. You won't need your phone at all for this, because you're going to be able to turn the whole thing in on whatever other electronic device you have. All right, let me know if you have any questions.